This submission explores how extreme helicopter parenting and shielding children from failure have unintentionally created a generation of young adults struggling with severe anxiety and a deficit in basic life skills. It is a highly compelling piece, so we are jumping straight to our feedback today to focus on tightening the narrative and expanding its depth.
Right. And jumping into that first piece of feedback, broadening the scope of the argument to include systemic pressures alongside parenting styles can significantly deepen the material's impact. Because right now, the text heavily attributes this generational anxiety and these skill deficits, things like the intense fear of making decisions or telephobia.
Almost entirely to a specific overparenting style.
Exactly. It creates this somewhat closed loop. I mean, as a reader, I'm going through these fascinating anecdotes about parents refusing to let their kids experience manageable failure. And while it's highly engaging, I can't help but feel a massive piece of the puzzle is missing. The text isolates parents as the sole variable, which inadvertently shrinks the scale of the problem.
Yeah, it ignores the actual, highly complex world these sheltered children are eventually forced to step into. And the author actually mentions economic factors like housing costs and career instability in the very first paragraph, but then just, drops them to focus solely on the emotional unpreparedness caused by upbringing.
We need to acknowledge those broader societal and economic factors as amplifiers of the helicopter parenting effect, creating a much more robust and multidimensional argument.
We definitely don't want to lose the focus on the parents entirely. I mean, if we lean too hard into the housing crisis or inflation, it suddenly turns into a macroeconomic paper.
Right, and we lose that great psychological hook the author built. The trick is framing the parents' actions against that economic backdrop. We need to bridge those two ideas.
The economy is the stage, not the main character. Think about how they could actually write this on the page to maximize the impact. They could take that discarded point about modern economic pressures and use it to explain why the lack of childhood independence is so uniquely paralyzing today.
Because in a highly forgiving economy, a young adult who doesn't know how to cook or navigate a basic doctor's appointment might just stumble through and figure it out. The stakes are relatively low. They can afford to fail a few times.
But in today's landscape, where the cost of living is astronomical and the entry-level job market is hyper-competitive, the stakes of failure are objectively terrifying. Thrusting a young adult into that high-stakes environment without the foundational emotional tools to handle minor failures makes the situation infinitely worse.
When you frame it that way, it elevates the entire essay from a personal grievance to a piece of piercing sociological commentary. The reader suddenly feels the crushing weight of that reality. It's no longer just a complaint that someone wasn't taught to do laundry.
Right. It becomes a realization that if this young adult makes a single mistake at their demanding job, they might not make rent. The lack of resilience becomes a survival, not just an annoyance.
And that tension is exactly what the audience is craving. We can apply this same amplifier effect to the discussion of social media and the text too. The author briefly notes that parents in the 90s were influenced by cable television crime panics and mentions the internet accelerates paranoia. But what if we look at it from the perspective of the young adults themselves?
How the digital world is compounding their lack of coping skills.
Exactly. The hypervisibility of social media algorithms heightens baseline anxiety, making a sheltered upbringing a distinct disadvantage in a chaotic digital world.
A great way to implement this is to add a section explaining that growing up completely insulated means you have zero internal resilience. Then you're handed a smartphone and bombarded by a digital environment that constantly highlights global catastrophes, economic doom, and hyper-curated peer success.
It's sensory and emotional overload. The sheltered upbringing creates a void of coping mechanisms, and the algorithm essentially exploits that void. A kid who was never allowed to scrape their knee at the park has no context for how to process digital attacks or the relentless comparison culture online.
By weaving these external pressure, unforgiving economy, chaotic digital noise back into the narrative, the author shows the reader they grasp the complete picture. The overparenting is the spark, but modern society is the gasoline.
Threading the crucial distinction between adequate safeguarding and overparenting throughout the entire piece will create a much stronger and more cohesive narrative. This brings us right into the structural mechanics of the text.
Because right now, the material spends pages and pages detailing extreme anecdotes, like a parent demanding college dorm camera or driving 20 minutes to drop off a forgotten lunchbox. But it does all of this without establishing a baseline for what healthy protection actually looks like.
Which is so vital for the reader's trust. The critical differentiation between reasonable safety measures and stifling overinvolvement, is isolated at the very end of the piece. The author eventually clarifies that preventing a child from drowning in a pool is adequate safeguarding, whereas preventing a child from making a mess in the kitchen is overparenting.
But because we only get that clarification in the final act, the structural integrity of the first two acts suffers immensely. It leaves the audience wondering for too long where the author actually draws the line.
Yeah. As a reader, if I don't know your baseline, I might start to think you are advocating for zero supervision or borderline endangerment. The fix here is to introduce the framework of safeguarding versus stifling early on, using it as a continuous structural lens to evaluate the various anecdotes as they are presented.
Instead of dropping a massive block of nuance at the finish line, the author needs to distribute it evenly. Give the audience a clear rubric right from the beginning. If the audience has that rubric, they aren't distracted by their own internal counter-arguments while reading.
Let's look at that anecdote about the forgotten coat. Early in the material, the author talks about a parent rushing back to school to drop off a forgotten coat, arguing that this robs the child of a natural life lesson.
The author could immediately contrast that anecdote with a valid safety concern right there in the same paragraph. You write something like, if a child forgets their life-saving asthma inhaler, you rush to the school. That is safeguarding. But if they forget their coat and have to shiver for 10 minutes at recess, rushing to the school is stifling.
That structural pivot is brilliant. It establishes the boundaries early and tells the reader, I am a reasonable narrator. I understand the difference between peril and discomfort.
You can apply the same structural tension to the section discussing the 1990s crime pan. The text notes that parents started locking kids inside until they were teenagers due to televised kidnapping stories. The author could frame this entire historical section around the exact tension between real physical danger versus perceived danger.
By inserting the safeguarding versus stifling framework there, the author structurally demonstrates how the line between the two became blurred over time on a cultural level. You explain that while keeping a toddler away from a busy street is a biological imperative, treating a safe suburban sidewalk like an active war zone for a 12-year-old is where the instinct short circuits.
Exact. It links the small moments of acceptable risk directly to the formation of adult competence. When you structure the essay this way, the reader is constantly evaluating the text through this dual lens. They become active participants in the argument, rather than just passively reading a list of complaints about overbearing parents.
It builds immense credibility. The reader doesn't have to wait until page 10 to understand the author's precise philosophy. The author has anticipated the reader's skepticism and structurally woven the answer into the pacing of the narrative.
Which naturally brings up how the author is actually speaking to the reader and how they treat the subjects of these anecdotes. Because right now, there is a real disconnect between the empathy of the opening and the way the author talks about the young adults later on.
Harmonizing the empathetic vulnerability of the opening with the observational humor later on will ensure the core message resonates without inadvertently alienating the subjects being discussed. Let's look closely at how the material is currently paced from an emotional standpoint.
The opening is incredibly strong. The author frames overparenting as a form of neglect, explaining how the failure to teach a child to cook or clean resulted in their own struggles with basic self-care and even starvation in early adulthood. It's a deeply empathetic, serious, and highly effective hook.
It's a phenomenal opening because it frames the issue through a lens of genuine trauma and developmental delay. But as we move deeper into the text, we encounter a noticeable tonal whiplash. We go from that deeply personal framing at the beginning to a somewhat mocking tone used later for the subjects of the anecdotes.
Like the story about the 25-year-old man whose mother tracks him on the Life 360 app and scolds him over the phone for going to see a violent movie like Mad Max?
Right. The author notes that they and their friend giggled at him and later questions if he's just incompetent because his mother leaves pre-prepped meals for him in his apartment. And similarly, when discussing college students experiencing telephobia, the tone shifts into expressing relief at not having to answer their customer service calls.
This shift in tone drastically undercuts the initial premise. If overparenting is truly a form of neglect that leaves young adults paralyzed, then these young adults are the victims of that neglect, not the punchline. When you mock the person experiencing the anxiety, you lose the trust of any reader who might relate to that anxiety.
The author needs to maintain a consistent through line of empathy, even when critiquing the extreme, borderline absurd examples. Frame these young adults consistently as victims of a systemic parenting trend.
You can absolutely still include the humorous or shocking anecdotes. They are fantastic for pacing and keeping the reader engaged,
but the commentary surrounding those anecdotes must remain anchored in compassion.
Let's re-examine that Mad Max in Life 360 anecdote. Instead of simply laughing at the 25-year-old being scolded by his mother, reframe the observation to explicitly highlight the tragedy of his lost autonomy. The author could keep the story exactly as it is, because the scene itself is incredibly vivid, but change the concluding thought.
Instead of calling him incompetent, the author could write something like, "We giggled at first, but sitting in that apartment looking at the pre-made meals, the humor faded. Here was a grown man who had been completely stripped of his independence, living in a gilded cage built by his mother's anxiety."
That completely changes the resonance of the scene. It takes a moment of observational comedy and turns it into a poignant psychological observation that perfectly supports the thesis. It honors the empathy established in the opening. The reader feels a sense of profound pity rather than superiority.
We can do the exact same thing with the customer service telephobia section. The author mentions working at a call center where parents constantly called on behalf of their adult children, eventually forcing the company to switch entirely to live chat. Currently, the author just expresses relief at being off the phones and not having to deal with screaming parents anymore.
To harmonize the tone, use that moment to compassionately explore the genuine paralysis of outsourced power. Add a reflection saying, "While I was relieved to be off the phones, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of sorrow for a generation whose voices had been literally outsourced to their parents." The fact that an entire corporation had to restructure its communication channels because young adults are too terrified to speak on the phone isn't just an annoyance. It is a profound tragedy of stunted development.
When you read it like that, it hits so much harder. It respects the core premise of the entire piece. It acknowledges that if an easier childhood unintentionally leads to a harder adulthood, the people living that harder adulthood deserve our understanding, not our mockery.
It aligns the author's incredible opening vulnerability with their external observations, creating a truly masterful, cohesive style. It ensures that the reader remains on the side of the author throughout the entire journey.
As a reader, I trust a narrator who can look at an absurd situation, like a corporation changing its entire infrastructure because 20-somethings are afraid of the telephone, and find the underlying human tragedy in it. That is the mark of an exceptional writer.
It elevates the text from a simple observation of a generational quirk into a deeply moving exploration of what it means to be robbed of your own capability. When you combine that emotional resonance with the structural improvements and the expanded scope, the material transforms entirely.
To quickly recap the actionable steps for the author. First, pull those societal pressures back into the narrative. Take the modern economic realities and the chaos of social media algorithms and use them to raise the stakes. Show us why a lack of childhood independence is so uniquely devastating in today's world.
Second, take that crucial distinction between adequate safeguarding and stifling over-involvement and thread it consistently throughout the entire piece. Don't hide your baseline at the end of the text. Use the forgotten coat versus the life-saving medication framework early on so the reader knows exactly where your boundaries are.
And finally, harmonize the tone. Keep the vivid, absurd anecdotes, but ensure the commentary surrounding them matches the deep empathy of your opening. Treat the young adults in your examples as victims of a systemic trend, not as punchlines to a joke.
We want to thank the listener for submitting such rich, thought-provoking, and highly relevant material. The core of this text is remarkably strong. We highly encourage you to apply these actionable suggestions to your draft and submit your revised work back in for another critique.
We look forward to seeing how this piece evolves.